Yeah. Just want to acknowledge the Larrakia, the country that where Darwin's been sitting on since 1869. And welcome to the land space. This area here is an event space where we do book launches and all sorts of events here. And then that collaboration between Northern Institute and Library and Archives NT is a continuing focus on history and culture of the top end and Northern Australia. So I'd like to hand over to Michael and Professor Michael Christie from the Northern Institute.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Charlie. Yep, welcome to our first special seminar from between the Northern Institute from Charles Darwin University and the Library and Archives of the Northern Territory. I am working in the Northern Institute upstairs in the Indigenous Knowledge and Governance area. And I'm here happy to introduce Jan to you. When I started working at Charles Darwin University, which back then was Northern Territory University, in 1994, I was setting up the Yolngu Languages program, and Jan was working there with community development and working with Aboriginal young people in what they called the Aboriginal Task Force. Before that, before Jan was at NTU, she had worked 15 years with Indigenous communities in remote areas of Western Australia's Pilbara and Kimberley area and in Kalkarigi, and practicing basically working with Aboriginal people on community development. She wrote a master's thesis theorising that work and the work of Indigenous women establishing family support networks systems in between 75 and 80, and then a PhD at CDU on the community transformation strategies in the Kimberley during that same period. And another PhD at Monash University researching the life of Don McLeod, who is the subject of our interesting talk today. Now, over 30 years later, Jan is retired and a Charles Darwin University fellow with the Faculty of Arts and Society. And she is about to publish a biography of Don McLeod and is researching and writing a biography of Stan Davey, who was the co-founder of the Victorian Aborigines Advancement League and the co-founder and general secretary of the Federal Council for Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, both of which organisations he worked for over 10 years each. But today's seminar is entitled They Couldn't Break Me, and it's exploring the extraordinary life of Don McLeod, a miner who became a pivotal ally to Aboriginal pastoral workers in the Pilbara. Starting in the 1940s, he supported nearly 800 Aboriginal workers as they led Australia's longest industrial strike, guided by senior lawmen from coastal and desert communities. Jan will share stories from her time working with the McLeod and the Nyangumarta people and offer insights from her upcoming biography. This is a rare chance to learn about a remarkable chapter of resistance, leadership and community strength. Jan will talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll be open to taking questions online and in the room. There are people that are on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, please ask your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat section. Okay, thank you. I'll hand it over to Jan now, and I hope that we will be able to get some short and sharp questions or comments when she's finished. Okay, thanks, Jan. Has Don got the clicker?
1st of May 1946. Although 80 years ago, it still reverberates. An event in Western Australia that exposed a great injustice. On that date, senior lawmen from about 800 pastoral workers on 20 pastoral stations in Western Australia's Pilbara region. Can we have a map of the Pilbara, Don, please? Thank you. These senior leaders gave an instruction to their people. Strike, they said. We strike. They said they were striking for wages and conditions, but their only on-site supporter of the white fellow, Don McLeod, knew that those words were code for injustice. He was the perfect ally, but through the hardships in his own life, he had developed a defiant and pugnacious persona and identified with them. When confronted by overwhelming forces against him, he stood strongly in his ethical position and nothing could break him. Although keenly aware that they were totally controlled by the pastoralists and police and government officials, the Mangu, as they called themselves, did not know why. They were helpless, having not been taught to read and write, and only able to interpret the world through those controllers. You don't have to put up with it, McLeod told the Mangu. I will help you. And they acted. They went out on strike, about 800 people. It created mayhem in the pastoral industry and total shock in government circles. The strike lasted 3 years, but they always called themselves strikers, their new identity. McLeod went in with the strikers, working and suffering with them for the rest of his life. I counted those years to see he gave them 12 years part-time and 50 years full-time. And I have given 10 years of my life trying to understand why. I thank McLeod's family of origin and the strikers' descendants for giving me permission to talk about what I learned and to show the photos that I took in their mining camps in 1950, 1968, 69. So the Pilbara. The Pilbara region is massive, approximately 6 times the size of Tasmania. Even though on this map it is a pretty apricot colour, on the ground it is hot, rough, prickly and rocky. For the tough working man, Don McLeod, it was heaven, and his definition of heaven was money. For he was a shrewd miner and he could make a lot of it. In 1968, when I met Don McLeod in his Pilbara camp, he was only 60 years old. Yet he looked to me like the hind leg of an emaciated kangaroo. Sorry, kangaroos. Although I was with my husband, Stan Davey, whom he knew and accepted, I was a stranger and he didn't want to talk to me. But then he relented, and as a perfect gentleman, he pulled out his best rusty old flower drum, wiped the worst of the grot off it, and invited me to sit down. I did. And as I listened to him talking, I realised, as had Australian author Patsy Adams Smith when she met him in 1961, that here was the man who was the force behind the first recorded strike of Aboriginal labour. Why, I asked myself, did this man forfeit his ambition to become a millionaire through mining and instead impoverish himself by donating to the Aboriginal pastoral workers all his wealth and his mining equipment, and then work for them for no pay and go to jail for them, and in the process alienate himself from his own kind and become the most hated man in the Pilbara? He must have had a compelling reason. I began to investigate. I learned that the pastoral workers did not forget what he was doing for them. He was their man, the first white fella to really listen to their grievances about the bewildering controls the pastoralists, police and Native Affairs departmental officers exercised over them. In 1961, one Aboriginal man of high cultural status said, "We've seen many up and downs, but the old man McLeod always been stick by us." In 1971, senior lawman Jacob Obadu told Ted Egan, "When everybody else was trying to starve us and smash us, that's the only man who stayed with us." There's quite a story in those words, and it starts in 1937. In 1937, when he was 29 years old, McLeod was a popular and respected man in Western Australia's remote area society. He could do almost any job needed on the pastoral stations or in the mines. He earned good money as a prospector, mine owner, well sinker, fencer, windmill erector, mechanic, wharfie, and general skilled labour. But in 1937, he crossed Western Australia's legal line, dividing Aboriginal people from all those of different ethnicities, and put himself in great danger. The line was government legislation controlling Aboriginal people, framed when Britain granted self-government to Western Australia in 1890. It was called the Aborigines Protection Act 1886. Originally instituted in 1886 to protect the Aboriginal people, it was used to create a Department of Native Affairs, and then, as the Native Administration Act, became a law that became an instrument to control them. In the remote areas of WA's northwest, this act managed Aboriginal labour on the pastoral stations. Through it, the government could take their wages, tell them where to go, control their every move, and take them to court if they disobeyed. Written in English, which the Aboriginal women and men were not taught to read, the Act had established a permit to employ. Station owners purchased a permit for the labourers they needed. This permit required the pastoralists to pay for medical treatment for their workers and other benefits, but as McLeod pointed out, it failed to say anything about wages or accommodation. As most pastoral stations were established on Aboriginal land, the people belonging to that land stayed there in what became known as station camps. Anyone without a permit could not come within 100 yards of a group of Aboriginal people. If caught, the perpetrator of this crime faced jail. And so in the Pilbara, apartheid became the norm. And the public did not know what life was like for those controlled by the Act. And why ask? The Aboriginal people looked contented, camping together on the pastoral stations, available whenever the boss called, men working on the pastoral station, women in the homestead, not needing wages and keeping to themselves. Until in 1937, this 29-year-old McLeod saw an old Aboriginal man in a station camp who was ill. McLeod did not have a permit to go closer than 100 yards to this old man, but he did have an aversion to unjust authority. He took the risk. He crossed the line. He helped the old man into his truck and drove him to hospital. A 200-kilometre round trip, same as I do for anybody, he said. Doctors and nurses saved the old man's life, but his family credited McLeod with the outcome. The old man was a senior lawman for his people, and he told them to watch this white fella, who was different from all others. They did, testing him until they decided he was trustworthy. And then they asked him why they were in trouble. What kind of trouble, McLeod asked them. Mungo tried to describe it. Trouble they were in, no wages, they didn't get good food from the pastoralists, they had to do whatever they were told. Worse still, they could be rounded up. If they tried to leave the pastoral station, they could be rounded up by the police and either taken back to the pastoral station, or if they refused to go back to the pastoral station, they'd be taken to court and they'd be jailed. McLeod was a Scot. Scots were tough. They could live on porridge, he said. And his ancestors were fighting men from the highlands. And likewise, he scorned those who could not endure pain. But he could not erase his own. When he was 4 years old, his mother had died and his father placed his children in a convent. Don felt subjected to brutal rules and treatment that he could not understand, but was powerless to oppose. Well, it was a good, hard training, he told Stan Davey. It helped him identify with the pastoral workers. He determined to find out more about their helplessness and the injustices perpetrated against them. Why was this so? The mongrel asked the white fella. He said he didn't know, but he promised to find out, and he was a miner. After all, and miners dug and dug until they struck gold. He dug in the library in Perth and he found gold. On a business trip to Perth, he researched the question, and this was the answer: the Native Administration Act 1936. This act became the enemy, and he knew that to obtain justice, it had to be dismantled. McLeod suggested to the Aboriginal lawmen that had they been taught to read and write in English and educated about the principles of British democratic political systems, they could have argued for their legal freedoms from the Native Administration Act. But the situation was not hopeless, he told them, because this legislation was still open to challenge. Western laws were made by politicians and could be changed, where their laws were bound by the authority of their own lawmen, who had the power to recover their autonomy, McLeod told them. He could show them how, he said, should they choose to discuss strategies and act. Unbeknownst to the pastoralists and government officials, the pastoral workers were subjected to this law. They had kept it hidden. But now the senior lawman decided to share it with this strange white fella who had offered to help them recover their economy. They invited him to an important meeting, law meeting, held once every 50 years or so, representing approximately 7,000 desert people, attended by men and women from Wyndham in the north to the Gurindji in the east. The lawmen discussed McLeod's information. Independence meant their freedom to choose. And as Bob Marley phrased it, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. At the meeting, their top philosophers gave McLeod a crash course in parts of their traditional law. McLeod explained Western law. The major difference was, he said, that where their law could not be changed, Western law could. As their near slavery conditions were caused by Western law, they could challenge it. Had their people been taught to speak English and to read and write, they could have disputed the right of the government to impose regulations on them just because they were Aboriginal. He told them that white fellas in similar situations gained power by withdrawing their labour. It was an action named striking. The pastoral workers would act, they decided. And this time it was their senior lawmen who would be issuing orders, not their alien masters. The lawmen adopted McLeod's recommendation to strike on the 1st of May, a date that would harness their cause to the International Labour Day and put the Australian Mangu right at the forefront of all the struggles of the working class peoples of the world, shoulder to shoulder, he said. The lawmen trusted this white fella to explain the workings of the mysterious Western culture imposed on them and asked him to help them by showing them what to do. McLeod knew that by consenting to this request, he was exposing himself to arrest, loss of income security, and alienation from his own society. He didn't think he had the skills or courage to do what would be necessary, but he knew he had to say yes and take the risk. He asked them to guarantee that they would be solid, for he anticipated that the full force of Western law would be used to break the strike. And he as a collaborator would be a prime target. The lawmen stood firm. To overcome their powerlessness in the dominant economic and political structures and their helplessness in a world of reading and writing, they appointed McLeod to be their representative in the Western Domain. McLeod accepted, knowing that his ambition to become a millionaire was no longer valid and that he would become an outcast in his own society. But he said, I had to do it. The strikers were arrested and harassed and jailed, but would not give in. They did not succeed in changing the law. and ended the strike after 3 years, able to stay out because McLeod was their business advisor. His actions were noted, and the government then turned its attention on him, determined to extinguish this influence on the pastoral workers and have them return to their right and proper place in the economy. Extinguish McLeod became their mantra. Police arrested him 5 times on 7 charges, and the courts fined and jailed him. Pastoralists threatened to shoot him. He was refused accommodation in the single men's hotels in town. He was harassed, reviled by his own kind. From being a popular and successful member of Pilbara society, he became an outcast. He focused on his new job of helping the mine group stay solvent through work that he knew best, alluvial mining, but they had to do it by hand. In 1948, he devised a way to protect the strikers by passing legislation applying only to Aboriginal people. He established a proprietary limited company on their behalf. First proprietary limited company ever established in Australia for Aboriginal people. But it was in his name because Aboriginal people were not permitted to own companies. He transferred to it his right, title and interest in 16 mineral claims held in his name, plus his pastoral station with its machinery and other assets, and all plant and equipment, a tractor, 2 donkey trays, and 17 vehicles, including Bedford and Ford V8 trucks. These assets gave the strikers the greatest thing they needed, vehicles for mobility, so that they could travel all over the country mining. But he gave them more than his truck. He allowed them to put the products of their mining onto a ship that travelled from Port Hedland to Sydney, where he employed a broker to sell his own minerals on the world market. They were so successful they made enough money to buy not just gear, but to lease a pastoral station that was on land they wanted. To protect their interests from the Native Administration Act, McLeod finally established 3 proprietary limited companies, owned and operated by illiterate tribal elders, he said. Their existence infuriated the government, which applied all kinds of strategies to reclaim, in quotes, their natives. Or as they put it, to save the people from the machinations of that man McLeod, who must be using them to his own advantage. The irony here was that McLeod had to put pastoral stations and businesses in his name on behalf of the strikers, because under the Act, they were not allowed to own pastoral stations or businesses. We must pick the Act to pieces bit by bit, he told them. And being shareholders in a proprietary limited company was one way. One of the advantages of having their own company was that the company could employ their own people and didn't need a permit. Obviously, the government would not give McLeod a permit to employ. Government found ways of destroying the first company. So he established another one in 1955. Then there was a split in the community between the desert and the coastal people. And the second company was lost to the desert people. So in 1960, he established a third. It continues today and still holds their business. How much they influenced a political change, I cannot assess. But would this have happened without their campaigning? In 1954, parliamentarians assented to a new act, the Native Welfare Act. Notice the change, not native administration, native welfare. Stan and I offered to work for the nomad miners in 1969. At a formal meeting held at their mining camp, McLeod introduced us and explained our intention to work for the people if accepted. The people considered our offer and asked us to take classes at night in 3 mining camps so that they could gain their independence and interpret the world for themselves. They wanted us to teach English, reading and writing to the adults who had never been to school or held a pencil. That's the English class. They worked all day in the stinking hot sun with picks and shovels and any other bits they could find, digging up rocks to crush and yandy and send off to make money so they could keep going. And then at night time, they come to the classroom, which was under a tree, night time with tilly lamps, and learn to write. The way we taught writing was to say, what do you want to write? One person would say my name. We'd ask them, what's your name? And then we'd put some squiggles on a piece of paper and say, if you copy those squiggles, that spells your name. And what else do you want? What they wanted was a symbol of their independence. Independence was their goal. And a symbol of the independence was writing. And they had a truck that went into Port Hedland to pick up the stores. They wanted their own order. They wanted to give their order to the truck driver to take into town. So we said, what do you want to order? And one man said, tobacco. And we said, you put these squiggles on a piece of paper that's got your name on it and it's got tobacco. And what do you want? And this one wanted flour. And this one wanted tea leaf. And this one wanted sugar. And when the truck came back and the store order had their store packed in a bag with their name on it, they had achieved another degree of independence. But of course, things always went wrong. The opposition to these people was unbelievable. And it wasn't just government and pastoralist opposition, it was cyclones, it was floods. It was at the mercy of the very tough Pilbara environment. And while we saw that literacy was another tool for their independence and agreed to the proposition, we could only maintain it for 6 weeks. Their progress was fantastic, but bad times hit the mining market. A drum of mineral they'd sent around to the broker in Sydney had been found to be contaminated and was worthless. They were down on their knees. They had to go back to full-time mining and they couldn't continue with their literacy classes. They had to scatter again and the classes had to be terminated. Over the following years, they were battered by cyclones, government opposition, shortage of money and shortage of gear. McLeod's body and mind took an awful battering, but they had not yet broken the act and he had to keep going. They couldn't break me, was what he'd learned as a child when he was being monstered by adults at school who beat him and the helplessness that he felt. And he never lost that mantra. Whatever it is, we'll just keep going. By 1975, his mining expertise had enabled the strikers to earn enough money to buy back some of their land. So they wanted their land. It was not possible. There were no such things as land rights in those days. And he said to them, show me the land you want. And when the pastoral stations come up for sale, we can buy the land, we can buy the pastoral station, which they couldn't buy, but he could buy in their name, on their behalf. So they bought Strelly Station and appointed senior lawmen to manage portfolios so that all Western systems were designed to be culturally appropriate. They got their long-desired school with its own literature production centre, creating educational materials in several languages. And somewhere, I think, David Morgan, you're online. David Morgan worked with Michael, and David Morgan ran the literacy production centre for the nomads people at that time. They established a medical service to their outlying pastoral stations and schools and appointed one of their lawmen to supervise the doctor. They had what they called the same structure as Parliament. So they had their own parliamentarians in charge of everything. Then they bought a small aircraft to fly their doctors and teachers around the satellite communities. They developed a program to re-educate boys who went into town and gone drunk, taking them out into the desert to a camp managed by a senior couple and re-educating them in their law. They built their own housing, grew vegetables and ran cattle. They trained their young people to do most of the work requiring written English and employed professional whitefellas where necessary. McLeod camped on the veranda of the Australia homestead, from where he endlessly typed campaign letters. In 1972, Western Australian politicians replaced the Native Welfare Act with the WA Community Welfare Act. No longer were Aboriginal people to be governed and controlled separately from all others. That had to be a victory worthy of starvation, gauntness, and exhaustion. When McLeod was 88, surgeons removed his cancerous left eye. When my arm was amputated, he wrote to me and said, "We'll make a good pair, me with one eye and you with one arm." Worse for him than losing an eye was losing his driver's license. This was a serious challenge to his ability to work and fulfill his commitment to Nomads. Nomads was the name they given their company. Work always called. It was the only reason for Don to keep living. He could endure temporary breakdowns and mangled body parts, and nothing could crush his spirit, so long as he could work. Still going out into the desert, looking for water to sustain their communities. It was his job to put in water points for the people who wanted to return to their country and grow food. Nothing was going to deter this ghostly man from doing his job. But to a journalist, he was no longer the redneck's, this is a quote, the redneck's most feared foe, the original white stirrer, branded a traitor to his race and culture, determined to upset the cosy relationship between pastoralists, government and police, and ensure the Aboriginal people were treated as equals. No, Don was now a gaunt spectral figure with a hole in his head, a hard man for anyone to love. Single-minded, idiosyncratic, obsessed and forever argumentative. He drove his supporters to as much anguish as his enemies. No mercy, work. These are the boys before initiation who were sent out to cut tracks through the bush for their mining trucks. And the man on the left-hand side is their elder who's in charge of the boys. McLeod had work to do writing to politicians and campaigning to change unjust laws, but he began to lose energy. And it won't be long before I fall off the branch and return to the earth from which I sprang. However, his anticipated life beneath the soil was not to be. There was still work to be done. But it was getting slower, and the lawmen watched out for him during his occasional trips out into the desert. When he was 90, he contracted pneumonia and was taken to hospital in Perth. He discharged himself and went home to die. Mission accomplished on 13 April. He had been with strikers for 53 years, the first white fella to listen and hear what they were saying and work to overcome the injustices. He was a hard man to love, but he did not want love. Justice for their people, that's what he wanted. He died penniless, but ambition fulfilled. For most of his life, McLeod's own society saw him as, quote, once the most hated man in Northern Australia. But WA Attorney General Ron Bertram said, when Gandhi, Nehru and Mandela gave their lives or were imprisoned for their own kith and kin, Don McLeod was a white man and he devoted his life to the blacks. The lawman said, we must get someone to help us out. We was looking for bloke, and we find that bloke, Don McLeod. They buried him in their sacred country. I want to thank the Northern Institute's enthusiastic Kevin Chand for coordinating so patiently with me, to Camera House for cleaning up my old 1968-69 photos to make them meaningful, to Lance Don Christopherson for his brilliant slide preparation, to Lance Dr. Charlie Word for his keen eye on my wording, and to Professor Michael Christie for introducing me. And thanks to my publisher, Australian Scholarly Press, which will get my biography of Don McLeod onto the shelves by the end of the year so that I can get out all the details that tell the story by themselves. And on the 1st of May this year in the Pilbara and in Perth, the people will be celebrating 80 years since that amazing act. So this is my little contribution to those people. Thank you.
Very good presentation and filling in background to a story that most of us knew something about, but with great personal detail and historic background as well. So thanks, that's fantastic. We do have some time for some short questions or comments. If anybody would like to ask Jan her questions. Or is there anything online, Kevin?
Everyone's down.
We go one.
Yeah, if no one else has one. Hey, Jen, great talk, wonderful research. This is maybe a boring sort of administrative question, but what happened in that later period prior to his death in terms of the ownership of the companies? Sort of who was it transitioned to? How did that process work?
Left. The Nomads, that was the third company that he established.
Yeah.
And that still exists, and that's still their operating mechanism through the company.
Okay.
And the government destroyed the first company, it was anathema to the government that Aboriginal people had the power to have their own company, that they were illiterate tribal elders, signed on, so they learned to write their name, to manage and own a proprietary limited company, which McLeod had set up because it didn't need a permit to employ. As a company, it could employ anybody. So it was a very cunning trick on McLeod's part to give the people power and to get around. But since the act was the enemy, and since the government saw McLeod was the strength of the people, and they wanted to get rid of McLeod, they were very cunning. They said, these are our natives. What are you doing with our natives? We have management of West Australian natives. And this company is owned by natives and it employs natives, therefore it's ours. And they managed to get some directors onto the company. And then they held all the meetings in Perth, which McLeod couldn't attend. And so then they closed the company. So those were the devious strategies that they were up against all the time. It was the absolute shock and horror to the political system at the time that Aboriginal people should be independent because of that original act. One of the things I loved about McLeod was he was pretty bitter about some people. He had some very colourful language, which is probably better not to be recorded. But mainly his focus was on, it's the act, we've got to pull it to pieces. And they did. Wherever possible, they challenged the act. And they were so courageous. Have I got time to give you an example, or is it finishing up?
Yeah, and then we've got a couple of quick questions. What was the example? I'll stand by.
There was a line on West Australia's map that divided the Kimberley from the Pilbara. And the idea was that there was leprosy in the Kimberley and they didn't want Aboriginal people from the Kimberley coming south into the Pilbara and bringing leprosy. That's what they said. McLeod said if that was, and there was a particular law in the Native Administration Act that said if Aboriginal people came below the line, they could be arrested. McLeod said if that's the case, the act should be under the Health Act, not under the Native Administration Act. They said, McLeod said, this is a bit we can challenge, we can start, this is another bit that we can challenge. And what they did was they sent numbers of their people over the line, and they got arrested because, as McLeod said, the government people didn't want the ideas going up to the Kimberley. They didn't want these ideas that had destroyed the pastoral station economy in the Pilbara going into the Kimberley. And so they used the law to prevent the Aboriginal people from going into the Kimberley. But their strategy was to send masses of their people and allow themselves to be arrested. And in the early days, old Dully Binbin, one of their senior leaders, he said to the sergeant of police, because the sergeant of police said, if you do that, we'll arrest you. Old Dully said, how many jail you got, boss? And this sergeant said, oh, we've got one here and one there and one somewhere else. And old man Dully said, and how many bloke you can put in that jail, boss? And he said, oh, 100. Dully said, we'll have 100 for you tomorrow. And then they realised that arresting wasn't going to work anymore. So they were really brave, courageous people. And McLeod was caught up in there, jailed and arrested himself and losing all his income. But they changed the social, political and economic systems in Western Australia.
Kevin?
From a question from David Morgan. Jen, how did you
David Morgan. Yep.
Jen, how did you find the attitude to Don amongst the people you spoke to during research? Is he widely recognized as the remarkable man he was, or do all resentments persist?
Did you hear that?
I didn't get
Go once more, a bit louder.
How did you find the attitude to Don amongst the people you spoke to during research? Is he widely recognized as the remarkable man he was, or do all resentments persist?
That's exactly what Jan was asking me, saying, when you met him, what did you think of him? The question, Jan, is when you were doing the research for the book, how did people tend to remember him and regard him?
The word I always got was, he stuck by us when nobody else did. He was tough, but he stuck by us. And I know that when he was so hated in the Pilbara that seriously people were out to shoot him. They were out to cripple his vehicle, tip it down a mine shaft, anything to exterminate McLeod. So when he was sleeping, at times they put 4 of their senior lawmen at his head and his feet and his sides to protect him. So he was treasured, but he was still, he had very bad language, which he used to anybody who didn't agree with him, and he would argue. And so when people argued back with him, he would argue. And if you got called the things that he called you, then people wouldn't like it. But throughout all of that, they said he stuck with us. He gave us his life and he stuck with us.
Thank you. Was it?
Thank you, Jan. That was a very informative and, for me personally, broadened my knowledge and understanding of injustice in this country. There seems never to be any end of it, but this is new for me. Was he always a solo operator, or were there ever any co-conspirators in his scheme? And did anybody else adopt and copy the techniques that he pioneered?
There were many others who came in who were attracted to the cause. There were a lot of artists and people who wanted to help, but most people couldn't put up with the conditions. So you know Dorothy Hewitt's poem. She was going to write their story. She couldn't stick the conditions. The conditions were really, really hard. And he had no mercy. Everybody was just fighting to stay alive. So people would go up and stay with them as long as they could, but ultimately they left, or they'd have an argument with McLeod if they did the wrong thing. And so I think, generally speaking, there are a lot of people, particularly Michael and David Morgan, who rang in. Once they got Strelly Station, things settled down. They had their own station. They established all that amazing that infrastructure, the school and medical service. Things settled down, but there were two splits in the community based on tribal. So when they all left the pastoral stations, there was a mix of coastal and desert people, and they all had the same goal. But after they began to be successful, then they wanted their own lawmen. The coastal people didn't want the desert people's law, and vice versa, and they split along those lines twice that I know of. So in answer to that question, I think that he was an ornery old bugger, and he offended a lot of people, and he didn't care. And he just said, you're either with us or not. And you can either stick it out or you can't. But we can't look after you. So you're on your own, and if you've come to help, do what we need.
Thank you.
I think one more from Kevin. Who's this one from?
From Julie Hansen. Jan, this was so inspiring. How would you advise a health lecturer to use the story? What key messages could you teach health students about Australian history?
I like what Don said, that laws can be changed if they're unjust, where the Aboriginal law could not be changed. And the whole success of the strike is only because it was their lawmen told them to go on strike. They had to obey their senior lawman. But the weakness in the whitefellow law was that the whitefellow law could be changed. So the message I would give is, if laws are unjust, then challenge them. But you have to be willing to become, well, Janie would know, anybody who's worked in the unions would know, you have to be willing to suffer. And that comes from deep inside yourself. So in McLeod's case, it started off when his mother died and he got abused. And I think if you've got that emotional strength and you've got that character strength to go on challenging the unjust legislation, then we live in a democracy and we can do that. And as he said, as McLeod said to the people, you didn't know that you could change it because you heard the word law. And so you thought it was like your law couldn't be changed. But in a democracy, we can be, and they proved that they did. And as I said, he died happy. He wanted to be a millionaire, but he was talking about money. He died a millionaire because he knew that they'd achieved justice.
Thank you very much. That's a good place for us to end. That with you. If you want her email, ask Kevin. Yeah, that was great and inspiring. I've just got a couple of other things I need to say. I will refer to my papers here. Okay, just about next week. Next week we have a very special event, which is also a collaboration with the Library and Archives of Northern Territory, being held right here on Tuesday from 2 till 4 p.m. It is called Words and Things as Repositories of Hope for Peace and Justice on the Ground. So it's a sort of a cultural, philosophical, historical event. A didgeridoo and a boomerang that were originally made by Brinken, after whom the suburb is named, and is now Wardare community, came to life and then were lost for 80 years and last year have come back. And Nori, who works now in the Ulmo Studies area that we have been working on for many years, and Helen Veron is coming from Melbourne, and a couple of elders from Wadeye will be coming and talking about a story that stretches all the way to Japan. So that there was Japanese involvement in the stories where there's didgeridoo and where the boomerang came to life. If more information, you can have a look at the poster there on the table, and there's a QR code. So join elders, scholars and storytellers as they bring Charlie's legacy into the present. That was Charlie Brinken. Explore hope as a cultural force and trace the unexpected diplomatic power of musical heritage. In fact, I think there might be some miraki, some didgeridoo at the event. A celebration of return, remembrance and the possibilities of reconciliation. Here, Tuesday, 28th of April, 2 o'clock. And in fact, I think you can register through that QR code. Thanks again to the Library and Archives of the Northern Territory, to Tess, to Don, to Charlie and to everybody else, and for making this such an interesting start to our collaboration. Beautiful story. Thanks, Jan. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you.